Welcome to Equip Weekly Bible Studies. We've been in the book of Genesis in the life of Abraham. This is our third lesson on the life of Abraham. Today we are going to see three more lessons about faith. Last time we learned what faith meant and we saw two key lessons about faith. When the Bible uses the word faith, it means trusting God enough to act. And the first lesson we saw last week about it is that faith is based on facts, not feelings. And the second lesson we saw is that God counts us as righteous when we put our faith in Him. Today we're going to get our three lessons from chapter 17, but first you need a little background information before we look at the passage. So Abe was promised kids. I'll call him Abe. His name became Abraham. It started out as Abram. It's all the same person, okay? He was promised kids and that his kids would have a bunch of kids and they would become a great nation. But now he's really, really old and he hadn't had any kids. And so he made a decision to take a second wife and try to have kids with her. Her name was Hagar and the son that they had was Ishmael. And so it worked? ? That's the background. Go ahead and read Genesis 17 verses 15 to 21 in your paper Bible. And if you don't have one, I got a link in the description where you can read it online. So this is God's conversation with Abraham where he says, we're going to stick with plan A. You shouldn't have done what you did because I'm going to come through on what I promised and I'm going to do it my way. So there's three lessons about faith from this little passage. Number one is that even faithful people can have a failure of faith. That's what happened with Abraham. He had a failure of faith. God told him he would have kids, and so he should have trusted that God would give him kids in God's own way. But Abraham decided to go against God's ways to try to get a kid, and he took a second wife. That's not God's plan. Sometimes you'll hear people complain about the Bible, and they'll say, oh, the Bible has heroes that have multiple wives, so God is okay with it. That's not true, because the Bible records the heroes' failures. It had already said in Genesis 1 that God's plan for marriage was for one man and one woman for life. This goes against that. And really in all stories in the Old Testament where the hero gets a second or third or fourth wife, the story always points out how it goes bad for them. So this is a failure on Abraham's part. And so does that mean he was a faithless guy because he failed in faith? The Bible's very clear on that. No, it doesn't mean that. He is talked about throughout the Bible as a man of great faith, even though he failed in his faith. So he was faithful, even though he wasn't perfectly faithful. And that's a good lesson to us. When your faith fails, when you find that you've turned against God, when you've stopped believing in His promises and try to do things your own way, you can do what Abe did and just pick yourself back up and try again because God will accept you back. The second lesson from this little story is that God grows our faith by making us wait. How does that work? Well, God promises something. To Abe, He promised kids. So God might promise something to you in His Word. And you're like, great, God's going to give me this thing. Now what? I still don't have it. That's where Abraham was. So he's waiting. And you have to think, what do I do now? And being in that position makes us decide, am I still going to trust God even though I don't have the thing that He promised me? And so then you wait a little bit and you're like, I still don't have it. And then you wait a really, really long time and you're like, what gives? Why am I not getting this thing that God promised? And then if you still decide to trust God after all that waiting, you'll find that your faith has grown. It got harder and harder to trust God, and you still did. And then when He comes through for you, your trust in Him will have grown. You will have a closer relationship with Him and more faith for the next trial. And that sounds not that awesome, does it? Nobody likes to wait. But you have to admit, if God is doing that to grow our faith, then it would be for our own good. And you'd also have to admit that if God did the exact opposite and never made us wait, that would be really, really bad for us. Think about the type of people we would become if God never made us wait for anything. We would be spoiled. Mom, when does my new computer get here? And spoiled kids are never happy. God doesn't want that for us. The third lesson from this story, and this is the big one about faith, is that when we trust God, He comes through. This is what it says in chapter 21, verses 1 to 3. The Lord kept His word and did for Sarah exactly what He had promised. She became pregnant and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. This happened at just the time God said it would, and Abraham named their son Isaac. God always comes through on His promises. God promised Abraham that he would have kids. If you read the rest of God's word, you will find that He promises a number of things to us, those who follow Him after Jesus came 2,000 years after Abraham. If we put our trust in Jesus and believe that He died in our place, then we get forgiveness and we get a relationship with God. And then on top of that, God promises us all sorts of things. He promises us heaven. He promises us peace. He promises us guidance. He promises a way out of temptation when it gets too much for us. He promises that He will reward our efforts to serve Him. He promises that He will grow us spiritually. And He promises that we will make an impact on the world. And that's just scratching the surface on a few of the things that He promises us. So if you have put your trust in Jesus and started a relationship with God that way, and then you are trusting God to come through on those things I just mentioned and the many other things that the Bible promises that God will give us, then you will experience the same type of things Abraham did. You will see some failure in your faith, so be ready to pick yourself back up and turn back to God. You will find that God makes you wait, and if you stick with it, if you trust God even when you can't see the things that He's promised you, it will grow your faith. And third, and most of all, you will see that when you trust Him, He comes through on His promises. That's what we got for this period in Abraham's life. And next time we will see that everything Abraham was going through was leading him up to the big event in his life. And that is what we will study next week. And it's one of the most intense stories in the whole Bible. So be sure to tune in then. And until then, be strong in grace.